Juan Carlos, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dante. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. Well, look, it's been a tumultuous period in history.
Sure.
And what's really more crazy is that it's even worse for musicians.
Absolutely.
Now, you have a very unique history and background, not only from the standpoint of culturally, but the idea of you sort of, I guess, segueing or diverging into more of a choral
Yep.
situation as opposed to, being a rock and roller per
Yep.
se, right?
Yep.
So the question is, how did you get started?
Yeah.
And how did you end up going into more of a choral thing as opposed to more of a traditional music?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what would you say about that?
Yeah, so, grew up absolutely in love with music. I was singing all the time. The earliest recordings we have of me are like singing along to We Are the World and, stuff like that in the early 80s. And I just couldn't get enough of music. So my mom was the pianist at our church and my dad was a priest. And they loved music. My mom learned to play guitar while she was pregnant with me. So, the story goes that she's learning to play with the guitar on her pregnant belly, which probably influenced a lot of my musicality. But the first real musical training I got was as a boy chorister at an Episcopal cathedral. So imagine the robes with the ruffles and all that stuff, just crazy high church stuff. And that was my first formal training. And then, I did some school music stuff, but really, I saw my older brother learning to play guitar and playing along with songs like the Beatles and stuff like that. And that was really the first kind of musicianship that was mine. I taught myself how to play guitar. I asked for the song books for the songs I wanted to play and all that kind of stuff. So that was it's kind of this split thing, formal training in choir and then, my own music in guitar and stuff. And it's basically been that kind of back and forth my whole life.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you go to school for music? Obviously, you have a few degrees, but was it specifically for music?
Yeah, halfway through high school, you're trying to figure out what are you going to do? What are you going to, you're going to go off to college, you're going to major in whatever. And it was one of those situations that it was apparent to me that I would not be happy doing anything else but music. Whatever path I picked, I was always going to come back to music. And so about senior year of high school, I really started kind of just setting myself up so that I could major in music. And so I decided to stay close to home. My parents were going through a divorce at the time, so it made sense for me to kind of go to school locally. And San Diego State had a good music education program because I figured that, if you're a musician, you're going to teach at some point, whether you make it as a living or whatever. It's you're going to end up teaching private lessons or in the classroom.
Something to fall back on.
Exactly. And so I was all right, so that's my path. And even going into undergrad, I wasn't really sure if I was going to be instrumental or vocal music. And I was already getting work as a singer. I was being hired to be an assistant conductor at a middle school right out of high school. And I got a scholarship for opera right off the bat. So it was path of least resistance.
Yes.
And I felt like I was really excelling in the vocal music more so than instrumental. So I did that. And as I was finishing up undergrad, I started singing with San Diego Opera. I had a church gig, which was both contemporary and traditional music, and that was a half-time job. I was teaching piano lessons and just kind of making it work, as a professional musician.
Yes.
And so that just really kind of determined my path. I got a full-time church gig after that and was picking up stuff on the side, but then did professional musicianship for about 8 years before I went back to school for a master's in conducting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, my exposure to the choral side of music is perhaps a little bit more than people might think.
Mm-hmm.
People know me for playing instruments and being in the jazz world and, other idioms as well, but mainly in the jazz. However, in high school, I did take some choir.
No kidding.
And maybe the first couple of years of college, I did also take some choir. And for a brief period, I was in a musical situation with a very famous group called Take Six, where, I was put in a situation where I was exposed to things like Handel's Messiah, which is something sort of I picked up from them and sort of learned about.
Yeah.
But with that said, as far as exposure to different styles of music, if we fast forward to today,
Yeah.
what are some of the latest things that you have been sort of getting into musically on that side of the fence? In other words, are there some local choirs or groups that you have been influenced by, or, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. That's where I think we're in an interesting time, because when I was in school, the idea was like you could either do this kind of music or this kind of music. There wasn't really an ability to cross over. The teachers looked down on that. They're like, well, you need to get serious about classical music. And I've basically been trying to like reconcile that my whole life. And I heard a good word actually just recently from a colleague about authenticity and us being our authentic selves.
Yes.
Because we really compartmentalize, oh, I do this in this setting and I do this in this setting. And it kind of has really inspired me to be like, I want to use this type of music with a choir, and I want to use a choir with this type of music, and just like blur the boundaries, because like the idea that any of us just listen to one kind of music is ridiculous these days. Everybody loves and has an appreciation for so many different types of music. So, in addition to my church gig, I direct a professional choir, Sacra Profana.
Okay.
And we do like avant-garde, new music. We actually just did a piece by Anthony Davis, who's a local composer who won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2020 for his opera, The Central Park Five. And so we did this piece about the voyage of the Africans from Africa as captive slaves while being made slaves in North America. Brutal piece. And all in the octatonic mode, which is something the jazzers know,
yes,
and a few classical music nerds know, but it's like it's out there.
Yes.
It's hard for audiences to handle. But then we also do like pop songs. So like at the beginning of the pandemic, we were trying to figure out ways we could keep people singing together, and we're like, well, what if we had everybody like in their cars recording on their phones, but with me conducting in the middle?
Okay.
And so we're like, okay, well, what would we do? And so I was like, well, let's do that Gary Newman song, Cars. And he's like, here in my car, I feel safest of all. It's like, so we covered that as like a pop song, and then he ended up reposting the video we made, and it ended up getting like 30,000 hits or something like that.
Amazing.
So it's like I just love the idea that we can do different things and do it well. That's really what I'm passionate about now. It's like let's be our authentic selves in whatever setting. So. I really like, in terms of like what I'm listening to, there's definitely a lot of choirs out there, professional choirs that do really interesting stuff. Some of that is harder to transfer to what I do, but I'm kind of being informed by it. And I just heard a great choir called Lauda, and they're actually a professional choir based out of a church.
Yes.
But it's a Unitarian Universalist church, so they like are able to incorporate all these different like traditions and non-sacred stuff. So kind of inspired by that, but as well as like hip hop and singer-songwriter stuff, and some of like the indie bands that are out now, and just the sounds that they're coming up with. So I try to like incorporate all of that stuff.
So would you say that that's leaning more toward a hip hop version of a Gregorian chant?
Yeah, well, so that was one of the things that they did I thought was so interesting, was that they took this piece by Ralph Vaughan Williams, who's this old English composer from the 1900s and early 1900s, and they had one of their singers who's a trained operatic tenor, but who also does R&B and gospel stuff in LA, like on the side. And they're like, we want you to interpret this in whatever is authentic to you. And so he spent some time with it. And then they had the organ, this big church organ accompanying him, and he sang it in a soul style with embellishments and stuff like that. And it was really successful. And it was like, it just kind of convinced me that that kind of stuff used to be frowned on. But I think now we're kind of like coming to terms with, like, that's okay. And some of the reason that it was frowned on is because it was frankly racist.
Sure.
These racist divides of what things happen.
Sure.
Another cool thing that they did was they worked with Killer Mike, the rapper, who kind of came to fame for a lot of people during the riots in Atlanta, and he was helped speaking up to try to find some peace with that stuff. And they worked with him on a rap. So they did a choral arrangement of one of his raps with him, helping perform and guide that, produce that recording. So that was really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you touched on some interesting things there, and I'd like to contrast that with some world events.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously there is a war going on with Ukraine and Russia. Okay, and we have an influx of resources around the world to sort of assist the democracy, so to speak.
Yeah.
But you mentioned racism earlier, and are you aware of the situation with the migrants that are, obviously there is this diaspora coming out of Ukraine,
Yeah.
but are you aware of the fact that there are refugees that perhaps are from some African nations
Yep.
that are being denied access to the same trains that the average quote unquote Ukrainian is on?
Yeah, absolutely. That's heartbreaking. And I listened to an interview with one of the, I think it was an ambassador from Poland, because Poland shares that border with Ukraine, and he kind of touched on that, and he said that every Ukrainian citizen should be allowed, regardless of their background and that kind of stuff. But clearly, some of the border guards have been straight up racist. It's like, you can't be Ukrainian. You must be trying to sneak in here for that. It's frankly heartbreaking, because I think about the number of times where even the U.S. and other countries have essentially done what Russia has done, in invading a country for whatever reasons, and there's a lot less compassion for the people that are being invaded, because they're brown. They don't look like us. They're not the same religion. That kind of thing. And so I think right now, for those of us who are kind of like monitoring this situation, obviously we have compassion for Ukraine. It's not like nobody's saying, oh, we don't need to be supporting them, but for me, it's a reminder of like, okay, well, how did we respond in other similar situations? And that's tough. It's tough.
Sure. You have a very unique background yourself.
Yeah.
Now, have you ever experienced, I would say, just being real, just on paper, any sense of that racism that we might be sort of hinting on in Europe or even in the U.S. or wherever, just on paper, if you were to, send an email or, put a resume in with a university?
Yeah, yes. I mean, certainly, I joke that I'm white identifying, I'm white presenting. So people see me and they treat me a certain way because they have certain expectations of what a person like me looks like, and what kind of I'm going to bring to the table. And so I've seen everything from microaggressions, like, oh, how did you get a name like that? Or you don't look like a Juan, or something like that.
Sure.
Straight up to like everything. I'm old enough now that when I was in high school, you applied for a job at Baskin Robbins or Subway or something like that. You filled out a form survey, application, and you handed it in. And maybe a week or two later, somebody would give you a call. I never got a single call from one of those blind applications throughout high school. The first two jobs that I got were because people knew somebody who knew me.
Yeah.
And so that kind of thing. And it wasn't until in college, it's like where I was able to apply for something and got it without them knowing of something about me, because I had already built a resume that allowed me access to that kind of stuff. So I've definitely seen that, and I've also seen how people treat other folks differently than me because they see me as something else. So I've even had people who will talk negatively about Hispanics, not even really thinking about my name or my background.
Exactly.
So I've certainly seen that stuff, but really, I mean, the reality is that I have benefited from essentially appearing as a white person in this society.
I understand.
Yeah.
In one respect, I can sort of relate to this, I guess, dichotomy of how people might view you on paper and then viewing you in person from the standpoint of me, African American, a man of color, as they say, someone just viewing me from a distance or at a glance, but then having a conversation.
Yeah.
They have a different perspective. Would you say that those feelings of microaggression or just plain old racism, would you say that they're inherent?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's part of how we just kind of grow up in this culture. Yeah, I think that racism is just a part of who we are, frankly. And the more we can acknowledge that, the more we come to terms with it and kind of combat and challenge our personal biases, the better off we are, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Have you seen similar, I guess, aspects of that at the academic level? You're a college professor, and I was once, and I would say that one thing that I experienced in that particular area was something called black teacher bias. And that is specifically, you know, I'm not sure how it is at your school, but where I was, there is a survey after every class, every quarter, and so to speak. And just statistically, there tends to be more of bias or I would say a disregard or even a questioning of authority if it is a black professor. Now, this is obviously not in every school or every state or every institution, but it's more so if you have a black professor at a quote-unquote majority white school. So what aspects of that have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, you know, I unfortunately I've been in predominantly white faculties, so I haven't seen, you know, a side-by-side comparison, but I have noticed the sexism involved, especially in choral music. There just seems to be a skepticism to follow female conductors.
Sure.
There's always something that in part because the model of being a conductor has been so male dominated that they expect women to conform to that model without being themselves. They want them to conduct like a man, to do, you know, to talk, you know, and that's obviously it's just straight up sexist. So I've seen colleagues who are frankly more talented, more experienced, have better educations than me. I've seen people defer to me because they think that I really know what I'm doing, or I'm the boss, or whatever. So I've seen a, you know, it's not the same thing as the racism that you're expressing, but it's part of the same coin, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you see a change?
I do. I do see a change. In part because there's just some fantastic women who are being role models in that environment. I think that also the students today are better at combating those biases and understanding that. But there's just a personal dynamic, and I don't really have it figured out, but that they haven't figured out either. It's like they don't understand why, you know, they get defensive when you know a woman says something, you know, but they don't with the man. I don't understand it, but
sure.
But it's in a type to confront and examine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you say also that with this change that is moving forward, you know, maybe a little trudging slowly, moving forward, that the mindset of the people, in other words, like we have a black vice president, a female vice president, and we have a new Supreme Court justice that is also African American. Some people would perhaps argue that when certain people get in certain positions, they obviously are grateful for it, but they probably want to completely redo everything completely in the opposite direction, as opposed to just doing the job. In other words, when Barack Obama was president, he was a president for everyone. And a lot of people in the African American community were angered, and I would say that this anger was perhaps misguided.
Sure.
That it is not his responsibility as the first of what he is doing to right every wrong, because he's got to do a job for everybody. So there's a fine line, but there's some that will argue that a lot of people getting in that position want to completely change everything instead of just doing the job and being whatever they are. Yeah. I mean, what would you say?
No, that's a great point, and that's a huge expectation, a heavy burden for those people to do in leadership, because you know they had to weave a route to that position and dance around so many other expectations of whoever was in power, the majority rule, to get to this place. So that becomes a very difficult dance. I would almost argue that it's more the responsibility of people like myself, who are, you know, kind of majority. I look and represent somebody who is like the majority in power. It's my job to kind of help make these changes and implement these changes, and not the people who are coming up. You know, not the people of color, not the women, but it's when people like me that make those decisions really embrace that. That's when we've made a real difference.
Would you say that you have a unique and special duty?
Absolutely, I really do. You know, and I've thought about that, and I've talked to colleagues, in times, because I've got in the last 6 or 7 years, I've had some great opportunities, professionally, and sometimes I wonder, am I the right person for this? Maybe they're ready for a person of color. Maybe they're ready for, maybe I should step down so that somebody else could come up. And they said, no, you earned your position, but you have to use it. You have a responsibility to use it. And I've also seen, colleagues who have faced some of those same expectations. It's like, okay, now we've got, this woman here, she's going to change everything. It's like, no, she isn't. That's too much to ask of her. Why don't you help be the change,
Sure.
And so I see that going forward, and also finding ways, because I feel like I've only gotten here because people saw something in me and invested in me. And now it's important for me to use my resources to invest in the next generation.
Paying it forward.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Exactly. So that's how I see my role kind of going forward.
Sure. You touched a little bit on your background earlier, but tell us a little bit more about it. Are your parents both from the U.S. or what is the situation?
Yeah. So my dad was born and raised in Mexico. He lived there most of his life until he was in his late 20s, I think, early 30s.
Okay.
He was studying to be a Catholic priest.
Okay.
That didn't work out, and ended up in Texas, where he was teaching English for like community students, or sorry, teaching Spanish for English-speaking community students, and he met my grandparents who were taking classes there because they were going to do a trip to Europe and wanted to be able to speak Spanish, and then they were also involved in a Spanish-speaking congregation.
Yes.
And so they would have him over for lunch and stuff like that at their house in San Antonio. And he became involved in their church, where my mom was on the board there of that church, and she was there for the family dinners, and they kind of hit it off. And so they met in the late 70s and got married, and then they moved out here so that he could be Hispanic missioner for the Episcopal Diocese in San Diego. So, and I was born shortly after that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Juan, what do you like better? Being the director of a big mass choir or being the college professor in the classroom?
I enjoy both so much. The college classroom is really a long run, long term kind of game, because I think the best paybacks really are when you see students go off and do cool things, and then they become colleagues or they become friends, and that you see what they've done with what the seeds you sowed. So that's fantastic. But church can be similar in that you can see the long-term gains. And what I love about church is, especially in a church choir type of situation, is that you're with those people for years and years and years. They don't come and go, which can be the hard part of education, because you never know what's going to show up in your class, whether you're going to have a good group or what. But you kind of have that long-term consistency, and you see people have kids and their kids graduate and get married and all that stuff. So I really enjoy both sides of that. There's a lot to love in both situations.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Juan, what would you say to someone just coming up? We were all at that juncture at one point before we decided what we wanted to do or what path to take. What would you say to a young student, or even an older student, or anyone that is getting into the music area, and how would you advise them to find success for themselves?
Yeah. I think this is so true of a lot of musicians, professional musicians, but showing up is 90%. Being prepared and just being consistent will get you gigs in the end. Even if I've seen so many places where more talented folks just they wouldn't show up prepared, or they wouldn't show up at all. They were flaky, and people didn't want to work with them. And so it doesn't matter what your chops are like, although good chops are always good chops,
Sure.
But just showing up and being consistent, being in it for the long run.
Attitude.
Attitude. Oh, attitude is everything. I would much rather, take somebody who's going to contribute positively to the group, just the culture of the group, than I would who can just play circles around everybody but has a bad attitude.
Awesome.
So yeah, I think those are really the key points about being a professional musician, just being a musician in general.
Well, that's awesome advice, Juan Carlos. Appreciate you coming out today.
Likewise.
And best of luck to you. You're definitely the band leader's band leader.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Blessings.
Yeah, blessings.